Hey there, everybody. We are releasing another one of these off-the-record segments. This one is the Peter Theil segment. We release these every week for our patrons, and this one in particular we thought was very interesting because what comes up in the Peter Theil episode that we didn't get a chance to cover in the main show was Peter Thiel's connection to Jeffrey Epstein, something that we thought Joe Rogan would be very interested in. So we wanted to play that for you here. It's the entire off-the-record segment. I talked about this with the Graham Hancock that we released a couple weeks ago. There is a bunch of extra content while we're on break. You can go, if you became a patron, you could listen to a ton of episodes that we have already put out. These are essentially mini-sodes that are about a half an hour to 45 minutes long. They cover all the pieces that we thought were amusing, that we thought that were funny, et cetera, that we just couldn't fit into the main show. So we hope you enjoy this Peter Theil episode. Recognize that, like we suggested on the Graham Hancock episode, this doesn't have as many citations. This isn't as fact-checky as that stuff is. This is a little more off the cuff, so be ready for that. All right, we're going to leave you with this. Hope you enjoy this Peter Theil episode. Like we suggest, tons of content for patrons if you want to become a patron. And we just released on our patron feed to Roswell Filing Clerk and above, we just released another bonus episode, the July bonus episode, which is a long time ago, 2014 recording with Brian Dunning. So if you want to check that out, you can become a patron and you can listen to that right now. All right, we're going to leave you right now to listen to our off-the-record segment, Peter Theil.
My problem with that is I think plants are smart. Oh my God. What was that? Where'd you get the money? What'd you do? What are you doing down there? Why do people say you have UFOs? Like, what is the tax bracket of someone who makes $1 million a year? They're so vitamin rich. Oh my God, that's so crazy.
All right, Marsh, here we are, behind the curtain, gloves off. What did you think of Peter Theil?
So this is the first time I've ever seen Peter Theil talk. I've heard some stuff of his. I've heard an essay of his. I think it was Noah did an essay for Citation Needed, even possibly going through a Peter Theil thing he's written. And I was surprised by, I think there's an intensity to the way he speaks that in somebody if I knew them better, would argue that intensity is chemically induced. I don't know Peter Theil well enough to make an assumption like that. But there was certainly, he seemed like very tense and jacked in the way he was speaking. And just that, those moments, and that one moment that we highlighted that we had to leave in full, where he gets asked a very simple follow-up question and it's a 37-second silence. It just, it really surprised me how completely detached he seems to be from what the rest of us would agree is reality, especially for someone who has such a massive behind-the-scenes level of influence in your government and therefore the way the world works.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the connections between Peter Theil and J.D. Vance, and you see the rise of J.D. Vance from nobody to senator, from senator to vice president in a very short amount of time, that's something to definitely look at and pay attention to, I think, and especially because of, all the backing and all the really close contact with Theil. And I think, Peter Theil is one of these guys that Joe has on. He's been sort of surrounding himself with the ultra rich. And we wanted to go back very specifically and listen to Theil after Musk, because I was curious as to what Theil was going to talk about in comparison, and was he going to bring something that was his pet project? And clearly it was regulation. I think that was his pet project that he wanted to bring to talk to Joe. I think Theil is easier to listen to than Musk. I will say that. Theil is easier to listen to than Musk. And he seems, what he reminds me of is somebody who's like, I don't know, trying to impress a professor. You know what I mean? Like, it's somebody who's talking in a class and feels like he's trying to impress a professor rather than just having a down-to-earth conversation with a pretty regular guy. I think he's having a conversation that he's sort of grandstanding a lot throughout. And that's okay to have. I mean, it's okay to have those conversations, but I think Peter Thiel's metaphors and the ways in which he tries to tie subjects together is severely lacking to have that kind of wait, So-
Yeah. He'll use terms like my hermeneutic of suspicion. You're like, okay, let's dial it down a little bit here, man. Come on.
Malthusian, if you will.
Malthusianism. Yeah.
Okay. So let's get started. We're gonna jump right in. I teased this in the main episode. This is about Social Security and it being a Ponzi scheme.
I think my answers are probably all in the very libertarian direction. So it would be sort of figure out ways to have smaller governments, figure out ways, to increase the age on Social Security, means test Social Security so not everyone gets it. Just figure out ways to gradually dial back, a lot of these government benefits. And then that's insanely unpopular. So it's completely unrealistic on that level.
That bothers people that need Social Security.
Well, I said means tested.
Means tested. So people who don't need it don't get it.
Right. So
Social Security, like even if you're very wealthy, I don't even know how it works. Do you still get it?
Yeah, basically pretty much everyone gets it because it was originally rationalized as sort of a pension system, not as a welfare system. And so the fiction was you pay Social Security taxes and then you're entitled to get a pension out in the form of Social Security.
Right.
And because it was we told this fiction that it was a form of it was a pension system instead of an intergenerational Ponzi scheme or something like that. The fiction means everybody gets paid Social Security because it's a pension system. Whereas if we were more honest and said it's just a welfare system, maybe you could start dialing. You could probably rationalize in a lot of ways.
So what he wants to do is dial back common people benefits from the government. That's really what he wants to do. He's not talking about benefits from the government that benefit billionaires and corporations. He's talking about dialing back the basic benefits that all of us pay 6% of our salary to every week.
Yeah, exactly. Like his answer isn't to undo like huge tax cuts on the wealthy or to close tax loopholes on things like capital gains and offshored finance or anything like that. It's we need your nana to need less money to keep the heating on, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's solvent, and it has been forever. And it would be, if we kept with normal immigration numbers, it would be fine. If our population declines, there might be a problem in the future. But if we keep with immigration numbers, it should be okay. What billionaires want, and this is why it's a big topic for Elon too, is they want your money for more and different tax cuts for themselves and for their businesses. They want that money somewhere else. That money has been tied up in Social Security for so long. They want to see that money go somewhere else. They're talking about, there's a couple of these about that are talking about Social Security, and you can clearly see that these are very wealthy people. Joe didn't even know how Social Security works.
Yeah.
Like Joe has no need for Social Security. He will never need it. He has so much money that has been wrapped up in this show for so long. He'll draw it, but he won't know anything about it. He won't understand how it works at all. So again, this is two people who have no right to talk about this, talking about this. Next up, another piece about Social Security.
I think there's some guaranteed minimum you get, and then if you put more in, you get somewhat more, and then it's capped at a certain amount. And that's why Social Security taxes are capped at something like $150,000 a year. And then this is one of the really big tax increase proposals that's out there is to uncap it, which would effectively be a 12.4% income tax hike. On all your income.
Just to Social Security?
Sure, because the argument is the sort of progressive left Democrat argument is that it's why should you have a regressive Social Security tax? Why should you pay 12.4% or whatever the Social Security tax is, which half gets paid by you, half gets paid by your employer, but then it's capped at like 140, 150K, some level like that. And why should it be regressive? Where if you make 500K or $1 million a year, you pay zero tax on your marginal income. And that makes no sense if it's a welfare program. If it's a retirement savings program and your payout's capped, then if you don't need to put in more than you get out.
Well, that's logical, but there's not a lot of logic going on with the way people are talking about taxes today.
No, it makes sense. That's like you're talking about it as if it's a Ponzi scheme. If you tax correctly, it's not a Ponzi scheme, right? Like you suggest. Also, I want to point this out because they seem to be glossing over this. This is an income tax. This is where income comes in. So not a lot of super rich people have big incomes. Look at Jeff Bezos. He gets paid like something like $100,000 a year. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a small amount of money per year from Amazon. But he holds an immense amount of Amazon stock that he then borrows money and essentially uses that money to live an extravagant lifestyle. And then he pays very little on income tax. Well, income tax is one of the highest brackets that you can get taxed in our country. And so it's a really high tax rate. So Theil would never actually feel this sting anyway. It would only be on people who earn income.
Yeah, exactly. And arguably, you could say that's by design, because like these laws are typically drafted with a load of input and pressure from lobbyists and lobby groups to set where the thresholds are and what taxes apply when. And like, listeners, when was the last time you hired a lobbyist? Yeah, that's why these financial laws often don't favor you, because you can't afford a lobbyist. I can't afford a lobbyist. Peter Thiel can afford a vice president.
Every time Joe has a billionaire on, they seem to talk about taxes and they seem to talk about the government and how the government should be spending its money. A billionaire is the worst person to talk to about this sort of thing. A billionaire is, they're going to talk about how you fix the government tax system, but they are talking about it from a very specific point of view. And billionaires have their money invested in lots of different things. So they're going to give you points of view that may be very skewed towards their investments in these things. So they may be telling you something that's very motivated, using motivated reasoning to tell you about certain things that would make you convinced that, oh, well, this is an important thing, when really it's just making sure that their pocket is fatter. This happens all the time with people. And there's also I think a little bit of survivorship bias, that such a few amount of people become billionaires that when they start talking about it, they have big gaping holes in their logic about how things should work. We shouldn't be listening to them when it comes to economic policy. They should be the last people we should be listening to, because they are constantly motivated to try to change economic policy to favor them. Get them out of the conversation. Start talking to people, economics professors, people who understand economics, people who are in government, who aren't like in the lobbyist pocket. That's who we should be having conversations about who should be taxing, not billionaires.
Yeah, exactly. Don't let your economic policy be dictated by someone who, by dint of where they are in the world, has almost no ability to understand the value of things. Because if you have over a certain amount of money, it is practically infinite money and nothing matters anymore. You can go off and buy a $1 million house tomorrow and not notice that you've spent that money. So the value of things is completely gone when you've got that amount of kind of distortive wealth.
It's funny to even think about these guys even owning $1 million house, right? Like $1 million house to them would be nothing. It'd be a tiny shack. It'd be a ranch that they go to with one room. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about a geopolitical double standard.
And then sort of the geopolitical problem with nuclear power was you either, you need a double standard where we have nuclear power in the U.S., but we don't allow other countries to have nuclear power because the U.S. gets to keep its nuclear weapons. We don't let 100 other countries have nuclear weapons. And that's an extreme double standard, probably a little bit hard to justify. Or you need some kind of really effective global governance where you have a one world government that regulates all this stuff, which doesn't sound that good either.
Yeah, or you just have international collaboration and non-proliferation agreements. Again, it's not one of these two choices. This could have almost gone in the toolbox section. This is a false dichotomy. You can just have agreements not to do that. And that is what we do in the world. There's an article from MIT, which I'll link in the show notes, which talks about how it says here, Germany, Japan, and South Korea are US allies who are not eager to make themselves targets for nuclear armed states, and instead they work with the US on defense matters. So should the US support a waiver, those countries might be more likely to pursue their own programs and get their own nuclear weapons for that reason.
Yeah, and we just incentivize people to use it as power and not as weapons. We had this deal with Iran. During Trump's last term, he wound up breaking that deal, but we had a nuclear deal with Iran so that they could use this nuclear research to look into using it as power. And then we had, before anybody sends any messages and says, oh, well, it was a bad deal or whatever it was that Trump said, what they'll often say is that we gave them $100 billion. Well, we didn't. We unfroze their assets. They had assets and we unfroze those assets. So it's not like we reached into our pockets and gave them $100 billion. We just unfroze the assets that were frozen in different places for Iran. And then we also wound up repealing sanctions to help give them, again, more money that they could then use. And then we had a monitoring policy in place and just to make sure Iran complied with this, and then they would be able to use this as power, and then we would pay attention to it and make sure they weren't using it as weapons, and they were happy to have their assets unfrozen and use it for power, and we were happy to make sure that they weren't making bombs. And now Trump wants that back. He broke it his first term. Now he wants it back again. So he's sending over people to talk to the Iranian people to try to get it back again. But it was a good deal. It was a good deal for everybody. They were going to get power. They were going to be help reintegrate them back into sort of the world economy, and they weren't going to make nukes, and everybody was going to be happy with it. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about how society can become risk averse and then feminized.
There's always a big picture question. People ask me, if I'm right about this picture of, this slowdown in tech, this sort of stagnation in many, many dimensions. And then there's always a question, why did this happen? And my cop-out answer is always why questions are overdetermined, because it can be there are multiple reasons, and so it could be why. It could be we became a more feminized, risk-averse society. It could be that the education system worked less well. It could be that we were just out of ideas. The easy ideas have been found. The hard ideas, nature's cupboard was bare. The low-hanging fruit had been picked. So that it can be overdetermined.
So I just think this idea that women are less risk averse can only be held by someone who's never talked to women who date men. Genuinely. Because every time a woman goes on a Tinder date, she's taking a bigger risk than most of the nuclear physicists on the Manhattan Project. Genuinely.
Joe's show very often could just be, have a tagline, just two rich guys jabbering about misogyny. That's basically, there's so many segments that are like this where there is clearly a constant jab towards anything feminine, and then they kind of always have to try to make that weaker. That's just something. It's just something that's built in his DNA. That is, and I wonder too if this is also a calculated and measured response to get him on Joe's good side. Because if he brings these things, these sort of undertone of misogyny, he gets on Joe's good side and can talk about whatever he wants.
Maybe it wouldn't it wouldn't surprise me at all if it wasn't that, if it's just this is how Peter Thiel also sees the world. It's just part of that Silicon Valley sort of clique.
I'm not saying that it is that, but it could be that, maybe he's clever or maybe he's just not a good person. Either one. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Egypt, because we got to do a little bit of, our old archaeology stuff, and this is that portion.
And I think while the rest of the world was essentially operating at a much lower vibration, there were people in Egypt that were doing some extraordinary things. I don't know how they got the information. Maybe they did get it from visitors. Maybe they did, but there's no real compelling evidence that they did. I think there's much more compelling evidence that a cataclysm happened. When you look at the Younger Dryas impact theory, it's all entirely based on science. It's entirely based on core samples and iridium content and also massive changes in the environment over a very short period of time, particularly the melting of the ice caps in North America and just impact craters all around the world that we know something happened roughly 11,000 years ago and probably again 10,000 years ago.
Did he say vibration to start?
He started with vibrations, yes, absolutely.
What is happening on this show? This is like correlation without causation. There's so many leaps of logics we get from craters to they had lost tech to build the pyramids. Like, just because those things happened around a certain time doesn't mean it automatically blew out all the life in the world. Like, that's just a silly thing to think, or blew out all the tech in the world.
Yeah.
Joe just really wants the pyramids to be something. He very much wants it. Did you see this week the big hullabaloo over the pyramids where they had done some sort of sonic resonance or some sort of LiDAR or something underneath the pyramids, and they saw
only
these big
vaguely.
pylons?
I didn't see anything particular.
Yeah. I'm waiting for it to appear on Joe's show, but I suspect I'll be digging deeply into it. That Flint Dibble did a whole video on it. I hadn't watched it, but it was an hour-long live stream he did where he talked about those particular pylons that are underneath the pyramids that they're seeing in these radar radar maps underneath. So we'll get to it eventually. I'm sure we're going to get to it.
Oh, we're going to do the Graham Hancock, Flint Dibble kind of area of Rogan for sure, I'm sure.
I'm dying to wait to hear Joe's take on this Signal thing that just broke yesterday. The Signal talking about, because he had Evan Hafer in, and Evan Hafer was like, man, I'm just happy to have these people in that know what it's like to be boots on the ground. You got Tulsi, you got JD, you got Hegseth, all these people, they know what it's like.
These
guys, they're absolute clowns using Signal to talk about a military plan. Like, it is so funny to see that. I am dying to hear Joe's take on that particular thing. I don't know if he'll ever bring it up, but I am dying to. If you're a listener and you hear Joe's take, send it to me. I'm dying to see what it is.
Yeah, I mean, we use Signal to plan this show. We don't use Signal to plan incursions into foreign states or bombing campaigns.
I will invite Hegseth to our next show, though. All right, now we're going to talk about history and how there can be a progressive view of history.
The sort of naive, the progressive views, things always just got monotonically better. And there's sort of this revisionist, purely progressive history where even the Roman Empire didn't decline. And even, this one sort of stupid way to quantify this stuff is with pure demographics. And so it's the question, how many people lived in the past? And the rises and falls of civilization story is there were more people who lived in the Roman Empire because it was more advanced. It could support a larger population. And then the population declined. The city of Rome maybe had 1 million people at its peak, and then by 650 AD, it's down to 10,000 people or less. You have this complete collapse in population, and then the sort of alternate, purely progressive view is the population has always just been monotonically increasing because it's a measure of how, in some sense, things in aggregate have always been getting better.
This is not the progressive view of history. There's nobody who thinks that the population of the world has always been, monotonically, slowly growing and has never gone backwards. Just nobody holds that view. This is a complete straw man. We know, for example, the Spanish flu infected 500 million people up to 1918 and killed something like 50 million people on a global population of 1.8 billion. So the Spanish flu alone killed 3% of the world, basically, and nobody disputes that, apart from maybe Rogan and some of his listeners who don't believe it because COVID wasn't that bad.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Black Death didn't kill half of the population of the planet or something like that, and it's hence amount. This is just a way to make it sound like progressive views are kooky. So he's attaching something that you suggest is a straw man. So you could say, well, aren't these progressives just kooky people? You can't even trust them when it comes to history, et cetera.
Yeah.
All right, now we're going to circle back to advanced civilizations again. This is another quick clip from that.
The one place where I differ is I do think our civilization today is, on some dimensions, way more advanced than any of these past civilizations were. I don't think any of them had nuclear weapons. I don't think any of them had, spaceships or anything like that. And so the failure mode is likely to be somewhat different from these past ones.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. It makes a lot of sense. It makes an awful lot of sense. I should have put this in the what was good about the episode. They're right.
Yeah, you're right.
We are watching a show where two guys act like it is profound to say that ancient people didn't have nukes and didn't have spaceships. So, they didn't.
This is a continuation of that same conversation.
I think technology progressed in a different direction. That's what I think. I think structural technology, building technology, had somehow or another achieved levels of competence that's not available today. When you look at the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, there's 2,300,000 stones in it. The whole thing points to due north, south, east, and west. It's an incredible achievement. The stones, some of them were moved from a quarry that was 500 miles away through the mountains. They have no idea how they did it. Massive stones. The ones inside the King's Chamber, where they're the biggest ones are 80 tons. It's crazy. The whole thing's crazy. How did they do that? Whatever they did without machines, supposedly. They did without the use of the combustion engine. They didn't have electricity. And yet they were able to do something that stands the test of time, not just so you could look at it. You can go to the Acropolis and see the Parthenon. It's gorgeous. It's amazing. It's incredible. But I can understand how people could have built it. The pyramids is one of those things you just look at and you go, what the fuck was going on here?
So he can see how the Greeks could build stuff, but not brown people. how could brown people build a big pile? I mean, the pyramids is like a pile shape. It's like you put the most of it at the bottom and the least of it at the top, and you'll naturally arrange yourself into a triangle. There's a lot more to it than that. But he talks about like, oh, it's perfectly aligned to all the different cardinal directions and things. But like, if we break down every one of those things, it's assuming that people back then were less practical and less intelligent. People back then were just as intelligent. They just had less of a grounding in the basic facts from like the accumulation of history that we've had. It's the standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing. So like, how do they get it to be perfectly aligned or so well aligned? Well, it's not hard to know which direction south is. We've known that for a very long time. You've got a sun to tell you that. You can kind of watch the movement of the sun. We can always figure that out. There's other stars as well. If you go to astronomy.com, they even explain that the corners of the Great Pyramid of Giza align well with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Researchers have spent years trying to understand how the builders were able to align the pyramid so precisely, and most accept that the ancient engineers used the motion of the sun, which has been there for a while. So yeah, it's impressive that they did it, but it's not mysterious. It's not magical. It's not a sign that something else has to have come along and shown them how to do it. You're just underestimating how ingenious people have always been.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that he says too is, there's all these, 2 million stones, et cetera. How do they get them all there? It's like most of them were quarried right there. Most of them were quarried literally right there. And then they moved the really big ones, these granite ones that he's suggesting, they moved these by boat. So they didn't just drag, the way he makes it seem is that they had to drag these things through a mountain range. They didn't. They just cut them and then they put them in a boat. They sailed them up to where this is and then they pulled them out and then they had to transport them from there. Sure. But, this idea that you can't get them there somehow is silly. And, I think he just needs to talk to Mel Gibson in the future because that guy used Dragon Ball Z powers to move them different places. And then we'll find the answer. He just hasn't had the answer yet, Marsh. This is true. Still too early. He hasn't talked to Mel. All right, next up, we're going to talk, this is a really strange bit about gods and kings.
I don't know if this is an alternate history theory, but I'm always into the James Frazer, Golden Bough, Rene Girard, violence, sacred history, where, you have always this question about the origins of monarchy and kingship. And the sort of Girard-Frazer intuition is that it's something like if every king is a kind of living god, then we have to also believe the opposite, that maybe every god is a dead or murdered king, and that somehow societies were organized around scapegoats. The scapegoats were, there was sort of a crisis in the archaic community. It got blamed on a scapegoat. The scapegoat was attributed all these powers, and then at some point, the scapegoat, before he gets executed, figures out a way to postpone his execution and turn the power into something real. And so there's sort of this very weird adjacency between the monarch and the scapegoat. And then, I don't know, the sort of riff would be that the first pyramid did not need to be invented. It was just the stones that were thrown on a victim. And then it somehow, and that's the original
stones
form.
That were thrown on a victim.
A community stones a victim to death. Tribe runs after a victim, you stone him to death. You throw stones on the victim. That's how you create the first tomb.
There's so much weird about this. So why would it possibly be true that all kings are fallen gods and all kings are living gods and therefore all gods are dead kings or murdered kings? Like, why would that there's nothing about that would suggest that it's true. He's just speculating about that. It's not based in anything. Why is he speculating that pyramids started off as a pile of murder stones? Like, why does that have to be true? Like, a pyramid as a structure, as I said, is a pile, but it's a fairly easy structure to build. Things naturally form into triangles through the act of gravity. It's not a leap to say that people would see that was possible and would pile things that way. Nothing that Peter Theil is saying here is based on anything at all. But this is the guy who was saying that climate science is spurious. But where's your standards here? The one thing he does touch on that's kind of a little bit interesting, he talks about substitution rituals. And I think this is kind of what he's alluding to. This is an article we actually published in The Skeptic magazine as well by a writer called Hadar Rubin. And in ancient Mesopotamia, rather than in Egypt, there was a ritual where if there was an eclipse, it would mean that the king was prophesied death, or an upcoming eclipse would be the prophecy that the king would die. And so to get around that prophecy, they'd invent this ritual where they take a criminal who was on like death row, essentially the equivalent of death row, and they would substitute that criminal into the king's place for a couple of days and then treat that criminal as the king and then kill that criminal. And then, therefore, the king would have the real king would have escaped the prophesized death because you've killed the criminal after you've made them king. The criminal will kind of consent to that because they get to have a sweet couple of days out of prison before they get killed. And then after the eclipse, the king resumes the throne, having felt like, oh, we've dodged a prophecy at that point. So it sort of feels like Theil is referring to that maybe, but that he believes it really is something, that there's something valid to it. It's really hard to understand what he's talking about. But I assume he's seen something like that and just kind of wrapped it into his gods are living kings and gods are dead kings and kings are living gods kind of tautology.
All right, next up, we're going to talk a little bit about Darwin and biology.
What do you think the factor was? There's a lot of debate about this. Like the factor was that separated us from these animals and why we became what we became. Because we're so vastly different than any other primate. Like, so what do you think took place? Like the doubling of the human brain size over a period of 2 million years is one of the greatest mysteries in the entire fossil record. We don't know what the fuck happened. There's a lot of theories. The throwing arm, cooking meat. There's a lot of theories. But we really have no idea.
Well, again, let me do sort of linguistic riff. I think Aristotelian Darwinian biology. Aristotle, you always differ things by put them in categories, and man. I think the line Aristotle has is something: man differs from the other animals in his greater aptitude for imitation, and I would say that we are these giant imitating machines. And of course, the Darwinian riff on this is, to imitate is to ape, and so we differ from the ape. We're more ape-like than the apes. We are far better at aping each other than the apes are.
So Theil is throwing around
that sentence.
It's so ridiculous. He's throwing out these like some complex wording, Aristotelian, Darwinian biology. And you think Aristotle, puts things in categories, and Darwin, was with different animals and things like that. So Aristotle is saying, well, we are different from the animals because we have imitation and animals don't. And again, this is a false dichotomy. There are animals in between the two who can do imitation. Chimps can do imitation. There are other animals. Birds can pick up habits from other birds, pick up traits from other birds. Crows, I think, can learn from other birds. So like this is another one of those false dichotomies. But he's just throwing around these words to sort of hide the fact that he's not really saying anything of any particular import. He's saying, like, let's play with linguistics. He's just doing, like, word association riffs. But Joe's question was, why did we evolve bigger brains? And his answer is, we like to copy each other. Which is not an answer to that question. Like, unless he's saying that someone developed a bigger brain and then someone else went, that's a good idea, I'll do that as well.
That's exactly it. It's keeping up with the Joneses, I think. I think that's what it is. It's your significant other asks, why don't we have a bigger brain? And then you put one on credit. That's how it works. Yeah, so, yeah. Next is another piece of that. This is literally the next section right after that.
Well, you can always tell these retrospective just so stories and how this all worked out, but it would seem the naive retrospective story would be that there are a lot of ways that humans are less strong than the other apes, or there are all these ways where we're in some sense weaker
physically,
but maybe it was just this basic trade-off. More of your energy went into your mind and into your brain, and then your fist wasn't as strong, but you could build a better axe, and that made you stronger than an ape. And that's where a brain with less energy was spent on growing a hair to keep warm in the winter, and then you use your brain to build an axe and skin a bear and get some fur for the winter, or something like that.
Yeah, I guess it's just such a leap. It's such a leap and different than any other animal. What was the primary motivating factor? Like, what was the thing? McKenna believes it was psilocybin. I'm sure you ever heard that theory, McKenna's stoned ape theory, which is a fascinating one. But there's a lot of different theories about what took place.
I just love this. Theil's thing is like, you know what? Don't grow hair. Save that energy to make an axe instead. That's the top tip. I titled this clip as well, "Why Are We Hairless and Smart?" And I was going to title it, Well, 50% of that. We've got half of that. But yeah, so that is what Peter Thiel's suggestion. And Joe's thing is, that sounds like a leap. I reckon it was drugs.
It's amazing, man. God, can I just say, like, why settle on this to talk about with a tech billionaire? Like, why is he has a tech billionaire in front of him, talk about investment strategy, talk about entrepreneurial spirit, talk about his vision for wealth in the future, talk about what made him invest in PayPal, what made him invest in Facebook, what did he see in those investments that made him see that might be a future thing that could make him a lot of money, whatever it is. This is a guy who has a lot of very specific knowledge about something, but you choose to go completely outside of his area of expertise to talk about why humans differed from the previous sort of evolutionary tree and developed a bigger brain. It's like, dude, you have a Weinstein in there all the time. You can talk to him about this. He probably knows, or at least he has a better idea on why it might have happened. He could have a dozen different ideas that could revolutionize evolutionary theory, because that's how he is. That's the type of thing he likes to talk about.
Yeah, I don't think we should be recommending Joe gets Brett Weinstein back on the show. We should be against that. But this is the problem, I think, with Joe. Joe's very proud of having these free flow conversations where he just spitballs into different things. And I can understand the value, I can understand the appeal of that, rather, to like spiral through lots of different topics. But this is kind of an evidence that he should probably have in mind a couple of directions to go, because otherwise he'll keep going back to the same directions he's interested in, or he won't have put the thought in to ask the interesting question at the time. It's like Joe would probably it feels like he'd get like Roger Federer on the show and ask him about like quantum physics. And then the next week have Stephen Hawking on the show and ask him about world-class tennis. It's like, if you'd just done some thinking, you'd have switched around the way that you're asking those questions, and it would have been in any way relevant.
Well, or you're getting like the take of like a national security advisor, a vice president, 3 billionaires, and a stand-up comedian on why humans have a bigger brain than our previous ancestors. None of those are great opinions. None of those are really breaking any ground. There's plenty of things you can tell. These are important people he's talking to. I would totally forgive this kind of chatter if it was you and I, or me and a buddy just having a conversation on a podcast, and it was just a shooting the shit conversation, just playing, like thinking about the world sort of thing. The stuff you used to do when you used to get high with your friends and chit chat. I would totally forgive it. But you're missing the boat on all these really important people that you're having on your show that are doing tons of really important things to our society, and you're talking to them about this. That's my only gripe.
Well, in fairness to him, he does bring some stuff up, some topics up that are incredibly relevant to Peter Thiel, and things that Peter Thiel has an awful lot of personal information on and personal experience on. So maybe we should come to that
our
now.
Next clip? Is that what you're doing? Let's talk a little bit about Peter Thiel, and then we're going to talk about sex scandals. We're going to move our way into Epstein.
And probably, I don't know, man. I spend too much time thinking about all the Epstein variants. Probably the sex stuff is overdone and everything else is underdone. It's like a limited hangout. We get to talk about the crazy underage sex and not about all the other questions. It's like when Alex Acosta testified for Labor Secretary, and he was the DA who'd prosecuted Epstein in 2008, 2009, and got him sort of the very light 13-month or whatever sentence. And it was a South Florida DA or whatever he was. And Acosta was asked, why did he get off so easily? And under congressional testimony, when he was up for Labor Secretary 2017, it was he belonged to intelligence. That's And then and so it's the question isn't about the sex with the underage women. The question is really about why was he so protected? And then I went down all these rabbit holes. Was he working for the Israelis or the Mossad or all this sort of stuff? And I've come to think that was very secondary. It was just the U.S.
I want to play this little clip for us. It's from C-SPAN. I'm going to link it in the show notes, but I want to play it. This is when Acosta is asked very specifically about that question.
Richard Lardner from the Associated Press. Mr. Secretary, were you ever made aware at any point in your handling of this case if Mr. Epstein was an intelligence asset of some sort?
So there has been reporting to that effect, and let me say there's been reporting to a lot of effects in this case, not just now, but over the years. And again, I would hesitate to take this reporting as fact. This was a case that was brought by our office. It was brought based on the facts. And I look at that reporting and others. I can't address it directly because of our guidelines. But I can tell you that a lot of reporting is just going down rabbit holes.
So you can hear in that little clip, that does not sound as, it doesn't sound as forceful as Peter is saying. He's definitely talking around it in a way to be like, yeah, there's reporting to that, but we can't really talk about it because I'm part of the government now and I can't really have that kind of conversation. But I just want to say, like, some reporting is just going down rabbit holes. And so it sounds to me like he's saying it's not. Now, should we believe everything the government says? No, we shouldn't believe everything the government says. Absolutely not. But I also recognize too, it certainly doesn't sound the way Peter made it out to sound. And
yeah, for sure.
You know, I also want to say too, like, this particular episode surprised me when I looked through the comments. Normally I look through the comments on YouTube and I'll just see a ton of people being like, this is such amazing work. You need to do this. You're the best journalist in the business, Joe Rogan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the top comment, 2,900 up thumbs on this comment. Here it is. Quote, I find it funny that Joe is talking about this billionaire, they spelled billionaire wrong, elite, Epstein and the CIA without ever mentioning Thiel himself is involved in all those areas, does not actually ask any direct question about the personal involvement and experience in those circles and conspiracies, end quote. So somebody in his audience, and this was up thumbed to the top, right? So this is the most up thumbed comment is at the top. And the first 4 or 5 are all very critical of Peter Thiel. This is the first time I've seen that on any of his posts. So it's something to think about.
I think it is reflective of something we've seen already, which is Joe has this strategic lack of curiosity when he's talking to somebody who could actually answer some of the questions he has elsewhere. So when he's wondering about why billionaires are so motivated to continue getting more and more money and possessions, he lacks that curiosity when he's talking to a billionaire.
Yeah.
He spends other parts of his show talking, other episodes talking at length about how weird the whole thing with Epstein is. We saw him with Ian Carroll talking about, I want to go through Epstein's island brick by brick and dig through the walls and dig underground to see what the evidence is. He wants to know what's kind of going on. And then when he's talking to somebody who we'll find out in a moment, literally talks about knowing Epstein and associating with Epstein, Joe seems to be very quick to accept Thiel's version of events. And I think I've mentioned before, I think we've talked about before, one of the impressions I'm getting from the time we've now spent watching Rogan is for all that is, it's this hyper-masculine space where raw masculinity is kind of celebrated. This is the most conflict-averse space I think I've ever encountered. There is no conflict here in almost any of the conversations. Do not rock the boat at any point.
It's pretty rare. Once in a while, he'll push back, but it's pretty rare. All right, we're going to continue on this sex scandal pathway.
But don't you think that's an effective strategy for controlling politicians? Getting them involved in sex scandals? I mean, that's always been one of the worst things that can happen to a politician. Look at Monica Lewinsky. A very simple one. Consensual, inappropriate sexual relationship between a president and a staffer, and it almost takes down the presidency. It causes him to get impeached. Powerful motivators.
So Bill Clinton wasn't framed and he wasn't honey-trapped. Bill Clinton made all of the choices here. Monica Lewinsky was incredibly young. She was like in her early 20s. She was she was a massive power differential in that he was the most powerful person in the country and she was an intern. He had all of the power and he pursued this and he made that happen. The way that Joe is talking about this, yet again, his version of events lessens the blame on the powerful man and places it somewhere else. It almost took down the presidency. Getting involved in sex scandals. Bill Clinton nobody got Bill Clinton involved in a sex scandal. Bill Clinton had sex with an intern. And that's what this scandal was.
Now we're going to bring Bill Gates into this conversation.
Do you have a theory on what was Bill Gates' complicity with Epstein?
I think he likes pussy. I think he's a man. I think he likes power. He likes monopoly. I mean, he's incredibly effective with Microsoft. And for the longest time, he was thought of as a villain, right? He was this antitrust villain. He was this guy who was monopolizing this operating system and controlling just this incredible empire. And he had a real bad rap. And then I think he wisely turned towards philanthropy. And
do you think that he needed Epstein?
I think it's very difficult for a very famous, very high-profile person to fuck around. I think it's very difficult. I think you have to worry about people telling people. You worry about it taking you down if you're having affairs. If you're running some philanthropy organization, you're supposed to be thought of as this guy who's like this wonderful person who's trying to really fix all the problems in the world, but really he's just flying around and banging all these different chicks. You have to figure out a way to pull that off. And this is what Eric Weinstein and we've had discussions about this. And Eric's position is that there are people in this world that can provide experiences for you and safely for people that are in that kind of a group. And that makes sense. It makes sense that if you pay people enough and you have people motivated in order to like establish these relationships and make sure that these things happen, when you get very high profile, you can't just be on a fucking dating app. And if you're a guy who likes to bang chicks, what are you going to do?
Man, everything is a conspiracy. I mean, the dude just cheated on his wife. That's all that happened. Here's a quote from an article. Asked if he had ever been unfaithful in his marriage, the 66-year-old philanthropist said, "I certainly made mistakes and I take responsibility," but didn't elaborate. "I don't think delving into the particulars at this point is constructive, but yes, I caused pain and I feel terrible about that," Gates told this reporter. So, it was on a talk show, I think, at the time. So there's a link in the show notes. You can read this article, but yet he says he was unfaithful in his marriage. You know, you don't have to hide it. Like, these people seem to think like, oh my gosh, you know, Epstein's got to get this sort of like curated experience, so he has all the dirt on Bill Gates. When it's like, Bill Gates can just find somebody and he can just meet somebody and he can just have an affair, because that happens literally all the time, and it happens to rich people all the time.
I think that's true, although it also wouldn't surprise me if that is one of the things that Epstein was identifying in Gates. If Epstein did introduce him to someone that wouldn't surprise me, because what we know about someone like Epstein is that they are manipulative. They identify people's weaknesses and they will target their approach at those weaknesses in order to ingratiate them into their world and pull them into that world. So I have no information on Bill Gates, but it wouldn't surprise me if Epstein did introduce him to somebody he would have an extramarital affair with or have whatever with. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was anything more sinister than that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't. That's for investigators to look into and figure out. So it doesn't have to be part of this big like honey trap. It doesn't have to be part of this, as Ian Carroll was saying, like this Mossad Israeli scheme in order to to blackmail the world's richest people. It could just be that Epstein wanted to be in those circles and could identify what need he could fill for people and do that to get into their trust.
That's perfectly valid. All right, we're going to continue on here, but we're going to talk about Gates more here.
You know, when Mr. Gates is just wearing sweaters and looks like Mr. Rogers, that something fishy is going on.
Right.
People have that sort of intuition.
They trust Jeff Bezos in his tight shirt, hanging out with his girlfriend on a yacht more.
Or Elon Musk. The vice signaling is safer than virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're virtue signaling, our intuition is something really, really, really sketchy.
Suspicious. We get suspicious, and I think rightly so.
I think this is not rightly so. I think this is incredibly stupid as a rubric to be running from. They're arguing that it's more trustworthy if you're just publicly malevolent than if you're publicly nice. Well, it's not, because if you're malevolent at all, if you're vice at all, then that's not as trustworthy. But also, it's making out that Elon Musk isn't constantly virtue signaling.
Right.
He's always virtue signaling. It's just the things he's signaling towards are things that people like Joe and Peter agree with, so they don't call them virtue signals. Like, Elon Musk wore a dark MAGA hat. That is a virtue signal to say, I agree with the things that you agree with. I am on your side on these topics. That's just virtue signaling.
Yeah. Well, he constantly screams about free speech, too, while doing a ton of things that silence certain voices on Twitter. He's virtue signaling about free speech all the time, but he never follows through on any. He doesn't get, like, Twitter isn't the Wild West. Twitter is his curated Wild West.
Oh, and this next clip is my second favorite behind the massive long pause, because we've had this conversation about Epstein and the value of Epstein and what he was doing for people like Bill Gates. And when Joe has spent a lot of time talking about Epstein and Israel and all this kind of stuff. So, like, we're getting into some deep Epstein stuff. And in the middle of that conversation, we find out how closely Peter Thiel knew Epstein. It suddenly comes up, and it's brilliant. There's a moment in here where Joe asks a question, and I had to pause, laugh, and then send you a summary immediately.
All right, here we go. Here's that conversation.
I do think Epstein knew a lot about taxes, and there were probably these complicated ways you could structure a nonprofit organization, especially as a way in a marital context that I think Epstein might have known a decent amount about.
How, when you were introduced to him?
I don't think Epstein would have been able to comment on superstring theory or something like that. Right. But I think this sort of thing he might have actually been pretty expert on.
When you were introduced to him, how was he described to you?
He was described as one of the smartest tax people in the world.
Interesting.
And I probably was my moral weakness that I.
Well, how could you have known back then? He had never been arrested.
And this was 2014. It was post arrest.
Oh, so his arrest was the first arrest, right?
Yeah,
which was like
2007, 08.
Okay. And so,
but you assume he didn't go to jail for that long.
Right.
It was probably not as serious as alleged. There was certainly the illusion that there were all these other people that I trusted. Reed, who introduced us, was he started LinkedIn. He was maybe too focused on business networking, but I thought he always had good judgment in people.
LinkedIn lunatics.
Oh my God. So, like, Joe is literally, oh, well, you could never, how could you have known what Epstein was like? Like, you never, like, you hung out with him before he was convicted. And Thiel's like, no. This was after he was convicted of being a pedophile, which is what his first conviction absolutely was. But Thiel has to explain this away. Like, oh, it's just probably because he was out so quickly. I assume it's just that it wasn't as bad as the charges made out. It was one of those times when they charged him for something, but then let him out. So they were just been exaggerating. It's one of those times where the law was exaggerating about how bad you actually were. Plus, he was pretty good at tax. So you do have to give the pedophile a pretty decent amount of leeway for how good he was at doing taxes and things like that. So the thing to bear in mind, right? He says, oh, maybe that was my moral vice. And yeah, it was. So maybe he was introduced to you as a tax expert, which to my understanding, it's not like Jeffrey Epstein was like a world's foremost leader in tax kind of law or anything like that. But like, he was introduced to you as a tax expert because he and the people around you knew that that's what would get Peter Thiel most interested in him. Certainly the hookups with women and underage women wasn't something Peter Thiel would have been interested in because Peter Thiel's gay. So like, we'll go down the tax line, and that's the thing that you're interested in. And even now, at the end of that clip, Thiel is maintaining that the person who introduced him has good judgment in people. The guy who introduced you to Jeffrey Epstein and says this guy's a really good guy to know, who's really good at tax. But, he's got good. I always thought he had good judgment in people.
Not everybody bats 1,000. Okay, come on, Marsh. Not everybody bats. I introduced you to Tom, so come on.
That is very true. And we don't know what Tom's been convicted. He's never been convicted of anything, to my knowledge.
Amazing.
Just think about it. Think of Joe's reactions to all of this. He's like, It's like, Joe is not at all fazed about this. This is someone who talks about how evil Jeffrey Epstein was. He talks about that all the time.
Yeah.
He links it to like Bill Gates hanging out with Epstein and how creepy that was and all these other people who were around Epstein. Isn't it so creepy that he was doing that? I want to go through his island home brick by brick to find all of the footage. I want the flight logs. I want the client list revealed. If you want to know the client list, ask this guy.
Ask the guy in front of you. He's literally right here. All right, so there's still a little more Epstein stuff we've got to get through. This is the last Epstein clip.
Yeah, I think there were probably different things that were pitched for different people.
Sure.
I was pitched on the taxes. I think there were probably other people that were more prone to the social club
debauchery,
part, and then there were probably people, and there was probably a fairly limited group where off the charts bad.
Wouldn't
stuff.
it be wonderful to know what the fuck was really going on? And maybe one day we will. Maybe one day some Whitney Webb type character will break it all down to us and explain to us in great detail exactly how this is formulated and what they were doing and how they were getting information out of people. But I think people have to age out. They have to die.
Like, Joe, if you want to know what's going on, ask Peter Thiel. He's clearly involved in that. Let's carry this conversation. Just before this bit as well, there's a bit that we didn't cover in a clip, but Joe talks about how many of his friends knew Epstein and how Epstein like pitched himself at different friends of Joe's in different ways. It's like, Joe, if you really want to know what's going on with Epstein, ask some of the many, many people that you know who hung out with Epstein an awful lot. You're calling for the release of the Epstein files. You don't need to. You can just pick up your address book and write Epstein client list on the front page and you'll have them, Joe.
Maybe ask a question like, hey, Peter, you were turned on to him because of taxes. You say, what did he do for your taxes? Like, what kind of stuff did he do for your taxes?
That's a very good point.
Maybe just ask that question, right? Because he said he has a claim. Okay, well, what did he do for you? Instead, he's just like, oh, yeah, I totally believe that. And we're not even going to go there. We're not even going to talk about it. We're not even going to move into this. There's a bunch of good conspiracy questions you could be asking him if the conspiracy was the most important thing. But what the conspiracy is a vehicle to dislike people he wants to dislike. That's what all conspiracies are really based in. And that's what this is. He's going to take the people who are sitting in front of him and they get carte blanche. They don't get nobody's going to question any of their motives. Nobody's going to question any of their problems, but anybody else is an absolute demon that's on that list.
Yeah, completely.
All right. Thank you, patrons. We very much appreciate it. We released this last week, our David Pakman show to Roswell filing clerks and above. So anybody who is a Roswell filing clerk or above got a whole episode dedicated to David Pakman. This was a 2020 episode that we covered, so you can go check that out. It was a lot of fun. Let us know, because we're going to have this upcoming month, we're going to have a suggestion box that we're going to ask you to put into, so please keep your eye out for that. We want to thank you, patrons. We'll join you next time for an extra. Thanks so much for being patrons.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call, we talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.